Right, so as you probably know, the Istanbul Convention was ratified by the UK this week. Philip Davies did a speech. He was one of only two politicians voted against, both of them Conservative. Most voted in favour, because if you don't vote in favour, that media is going to portray you as being a misogynist, and you need those votes, right? People won't vote for you if you're a misogynist. So basically, it was a foregone conclusion. It was going to get ratified because it's always reported on what politicians vote anyway now. You can look up what your local politician has voted for. And unless you want a lot of harassment, if you're a politician, you do what the feminists want you to. Unless you're very brave. And Philip Davies is clearly very brave. So he's done this speech, and what the Independent have done is they've done a little debunk where they've taken clips of the speech, and then after points that Philip Davies make, they then go into some sort of Twilight Zone type music and then display on the screen their objection to what he's just said and why what he said is either untrue or misleading. However, their debunk is all untrue and misleading, and in fact Philip Davies was right in all the instances on which they pick him up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show that video now. So when it goes ping, not true on the screen, that's not me doing that, that's the Independent. I'll be the one talking after that and saying why the Independent is wrong. Okay, so this is the Independent, and they've attempted to do a little debunk on Philip Davies' speech, but their debunk is full of mistakes, so let's correct
it's right that 2/3 of domestic violence incidents, the woman is the victim, which is absolutely outrageous.
The things you have to say when you're a politician, saying, it's absolutely outrageous. Why is that outrageous? Why is that outrageous? Would it be less outrageous if it was 50-50? Clearly, what percentage it is of the victims of domestic violence doesn't make any difference whether it's outrageous or not. The number of victims is what makes it outrageous, not how the percentage is divvied out. Very strange for them to say that's outrageous. I realise, of course, you're doing what we all have to do when we talk about male victims of domestic violence. We have to say that's not to say that we don't take violence against women seriously, but here's this thing as well. It's just rather funny there. What are you saying? What percentage would not be outrageous?
But in 1/3 of cases, the victim is a man. Now,
Independent's debunk is 1/3 of victims are men refers only to domestic violence homicides. This is because women are more likely to use a weapon and are thus more likely to kill. This raises non-fatal emotional and psychological abuse from which women disproportionately suffer, and the vast amount of abuse that goes unreported. Okay, that's rather a strange claim to make. So let's have a look at the Office for National Statistics and prevalence of intimate violence. It's based on intimate violence experience since the age of 16. 27.1% of women and 13.2% of men reported being a victim of any domestic abuse since the age of 16, which means twice as many women as men, which means that roughly 1 in 3 men experienced domestic violence sometime since the age of 16. Alright, let's have a look here at intimate violence experience in the last year. 8.2% of women and 4% of men reported having experienced any type of domestic abuse in the last year. So again, 1 in 3. This 1 in 3 has got nothing to do with homicide. It's quite interesting that she's done that, though, because she's actually throwing away the one trump card they could have had. The one trump card they could have had is that, in fact, women are 4 times more likely to be a victim of a domestic violence related fatality. If I was to suggest why that should be, when in fact men are more likely to have broken bones and bruising from domestic violence, that would seem to be incongruent, those two completely separate facts. Here it says there was no significant difference in the prevalence of physical injury for male and female victims, 29% and 23% respectively. Not a significant difference, but as you see, it's not the way you would expect 29% of men had a physical injury. So 23% of women, not a massive difference, but it is that the male victims are slightly higher, not lower. So, you know, if you were thinking, oh, the reason that women are more likely to die as a result of domestic violence than men is because men are stronger, I think you have to look elsewhere, because when it comes down to injuries, it's pretty much parity in terms of how likely you are to have an injury from domestic violence. So, as a theory that requires some further study, I'm going to suggest that the reason why there seems to be more fatalities associated with domestic violence for female victims than there is for male victims is because domestic violence related fatalities where the victims are women are unlikely to include deliberate murders, whereas I think the domestic violence related deaths for men is less likely to include deliberate murders, because women traditionally are supposed to choose poison, right, if they want to kill their partner. Before we move on, another thing the Independent debunked picking up there was that he was in some way erasing abuse that didn't get reported. Well, according to the Mankind Initiative, male victims are over twice as likely than women to not tell anyone about the partner abuse they're suffering from, 29% as opposed to 12%. Only 10% of male victims will tell the police, whereas 26% of women will tell the police. Only 23% will tell a person in an official position, whereas 43% of women would. And only 11%, compared to 23% of women, will tell a health professional. So, if there are victims that are being erased because they don't report, well, male victims that don't report are twice the number of female victims that don't report.
It's rather, I think it's so discriminatory and sexist to say that we should only be focusing on violence against women. And
so here's the Independent's debunk on this. The Commons was debating the Istanbul Convention for Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, which does not limit itself to female victims. It states measures to protect the rights of victims shall be secured without discrimination on any grounds, including gender. Now, you'd think that was clearly in speech marks, so she's clearly quoting something, right? I couldn't find that in the document, not at first. I was going for it, so I thought, oh, I'll do a search on that. And yeah, I found it. And then I realised I was looking at the wrong document. I was looking at another document, a document on public medicine. So I went on to the next document, and that was a document on child abuse. So I realised, oh, okay, that's a pretty standard thing. That sentence appears in most UN documents. Most UN documents have a principle of non-discrimination. So presumably it is in the Istanbul Convention as well. And yeah, when I eventually had another look at the Istanbul Convention, I just searched the word secured instead. Secured is a fairly unique word in the civil. I found it straight away. So yes, it does. This article appears in the Istanbul Convention, Article 3. The implementation of the provision of the Convention by the parties, in particular measures to protect the rights of victims, shall be secured without discrimination on any grounds such as sex, gender, race, colour, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, association with a national minority, property, birth, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, state of health, disability, marital status, migrant or refugee status, or other status. Isn't that lovely? Well, we can all breathe a sigh of relief then, can't we? I know it mentions women throughout the document, violence against women and domestic violence, but it does say that there is no discrimination. No discrimination. Promises no discrimination on victims. Doesn't it? Doesn't it? As you might expect, Article 3 is followed by Article 4, which states special measures that are necessary to prevent and protect women from gender-based violence shall not be considered discrimination under the terms of this convention. I kid you not, that's in there. So basically, it has a line saying, hey, there's going to be no discrimination, you know. Mind you, whatever we do should not be considered to be discrimination. So So you can discriminate then, as long as you can deem it necessary. It's basically an enabling law. They've actually followed up what is a very standard promise of non-discrimination. Very standard to all UN documents. Almost like a UN document isn't a UN document if it doesn't contain a line about non-discrimination. And then say whatever we do here isn't discrimination because it's necessary.
Men are treated more harshly than women in the criminal justice system, certainly when it comes to sentencing, and I know that's an inconvenient truth for many people, but it is the truth nevertheless.
So the Independent deemed this misleading, and the reason for saying that is because they say in general male violence is more likely to cause serious bodily harm and so carries higher sentences. This means it be forced to say men are treated more harshly than women in the justice system. Funny thing is, once upon a time it was the feminists who were claiming that it was women who were being dealt with more harshly by the criminal justice system. This paper was from 1994. It is often suggested the criminal justice system in England and Wales routinely discriminates against women. This paper, published under Section 95 of the Criminal Justice Act of 1991, concludes that the weight of evidence is against this claim. The key points of the study found that neither research nor statistical evidence support the claim that women are systematically dealt with more severely than men. Women are less likely to commit crimes than men, though self-report studies indicate that official statistics exaggerate the difference. Women and men differ in the extent to which they commit different sorts of offences. A high proportion of female offenders are cautioned for serious offences. The available evidence suggests that women are less likely to remand in custody than men. There are differences in the sentences men and women receive, but overall women seem more likely to receive lenient sentences. This is so even when previous convictions are taken into consideration. On remands, it says a smaller proportion of female offenders are remanded in custody than males. One of the few studies to investigate the reasons concluded this was partly because women were less likely than men to fall into high-risk categories, defined as those who had previously failed to appear after giving court bail or being charged with a further offence while on bail or of no fixed abode. This is only part of the story, however. Women falling into low-risk categories were still less likely to be remanded in custody than their male counterparts. Though relevant prison statistics are incomplete, they suggest that about 30% of women who are remanded in custody are subsequently sent to prison, compared to 40% of their male counterparts. Women on bail are also less likely to receive a custodial sentence, about 5% compared to 10% of men. Taken together, these findings suggest that men and women may be treated differently, both at the remand and the sentencing stage. And on sentencing, it says there are large overall differences in the sentencing of men and women. In particular, women are far less likely than men to receive a custodial sentence for virtually all indictable offences. The only exception is for drugs, which proportions are roughly equal, 40%. When women do receive prison sentences, these tend to be shorter than men's. In 1992, the average length of prison sentences awarded for indictable offences at the Crown Court was 17.7 months for women aged 21 or over, and 21.1 months for men. And this effect remains true even when you take into account repeat offences, as you can see. For first offences, men there on 8%, women on 3%. Even when you have 3 or more previous convictions, men are on 22%, whereas women are on 10%. So men still twice as likely to receive custodial sentences. On the grounds of homicide, bearing in mind that what the Independent was trying to claim was this was to do with how much damage men cause. People being dead is about as much damage as you can cause. Despite recent claims to the contrary, women are at less risk of imprisonment than men, even in cases of domestic homicide. Analysis of cases dealt with between 1984 and 1992 show that 23% of females, where only 4% of males indicted for homicide, were acquitted on all charges. Of those found guilty, 80% of the women, compared to 61% of the men, were found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter, and more than 2/3 of the men convicted of manslaughter received a prison sentence, compared to less than half the women. The fact remains, of course, that women are at much greater risk of domestic homicide. Much of the controversy around recent cases has surrounded the use of the provocation defence, which is said to be less easy for women to deploy. Information on recent cases show that 36% of women convicted of manslaughter used this defence, and under a third of the men. By combining the percentages employing the provocation defence with the percentages of men and women convicted of manslaughter, we can infer that a defence of provocation was exception in about 29% of cases involving female defendants, compared with 20% of cases involving men. One of the people making that claim that women found it harder to use the self-defence argument in cases of domestic manslaughter was Vera Baird. She was making the claim that whereas men can claim self-defence by retaliating in the heat of the moment, women don't retaliate in the heat of the moment. They retaliate later, and that should still count as self-defence, even if it involves shooting him in his bed while he's sleeping. That's still self-defence.
At that time, it was very easy for a violent man who'd beaten his partner many, many times to be acquitted of murder if he killed her, and to be convicted only of manslaughter by something called provocation, that she had provoked him into losing his self-control and killing her. So because of that provocation, the culpability was less than murder. He would get a sentence fixed by the judge, whereas a murder gets a life sentence in the UK. Switch to the woman who suffered from domestic abuse for many, many years, and finally, and I know that this is a typical story because there was one time in my career when I think I did about half of the cases of what were then called battered women who killed their violent partners. Something happens again, he's kicking off, she runs into the kitchen away from him, he's particularly frightening that night, she reaches into the sink and finds a knife as he's coming at her and stabs out once. You may have been victimised by him for a decade or more. I mean, or not, but...
Or not, but fuck it, who cares? Victim blaming. You know, the thing that feminists are always going about, isn't it awful that the victims of sexual offences against women are always blamed for what happened to them? Oh, he was stabbed, but he was particularly frightening that night. He may have victimised her for years, or not, but who cares?
Still, in a position where she had really no escape, and here he was coming again. She was always convicted of murder, always, until we got the law changed through the Emma Humphreys case, because provocation is about being angry and losing your self-control because someone's provoked you. It's not about being terrified so that you lash out to try to protect yourself. That defence didn't fit women, because of course it is correct to say that most murderers are men, most killers are men, but still the criminal justice system does have to take note of the forces that have played with women too. So in that case, Emma Humphreys really changed the law quite significantly. We altered it and made the impact of an immediately frightening experience which makes you lose your self-control equally as capable of being provocation. And now we, when we were in government, spun the law around quite substantially to stop guys getting off when they shouldn't and women being convicted when equally they shouldn't. So that's how I got involved really in any heavy kind of way with violence against women and girls.
So well done, Vera. You managed to challenge an inequality that didn't exist in order to widen an inequality that did exist. My God, that woman is a menace. Seriously, that woman is a menace. But this is rather odd, isn't it? Because that's 1994 that feminists are making the claim that the criminal justice system was more harsh towards women. Do you remember what Liana K said?
The sentencing gap. The men's rights movement and the anti-feminists do not own the complaints about the sentencing gap. The first ever feminists at the Seneca Falls Convention, in their declaration that kicked off the whole thing, kicked off the whole idea of a woman's right to vote, talked about the gap in criminal prosecutions, that women were seen as unaccountable under the law if they committed a crime with their husbands.
With their husbands. And she's talking here about the laws of coverture. But we're not even talking about the sentencing gap brought about by women being held less accountable for things they did with their husbands. We're talking about women being held accountable for things they did off their own back, on their own, independently, and it being blamed on provocation by a man in some way. Or quite often, if you go to Vera's Fallen Women, there's three options for reducing women's agency. One is to say a man provoked her to do it. The other is that a man coerced or corrupted her into doing it. He was the Satan that was whispering things into her ear, or setting a bad example to her, because women are so impressionable. And the third was that she was mentally ill, whereas mental illness was not being recognised in the men.
So you guys don't get to own that. That was the first wave feminists that brought that up way back before the anti-feminist movement got started in the 1970s.
The anti-feminist movement of the 1970s was a rejection of the ERA, and as a result it was mainly traditionalist women, not men's rights activists. In fact, men's liberation groups in the 1970s were generally pro-feminist. The feminists weren't very pro them, so we became anti-feminist over time. But we weren't anti-feminist back then. But putting that to one side, so if the first wave feminists were against the sentencing gap, but by 1991 they were saying the exact opposite, saying that women were unfairly treated by the criminal justice system, what happened? Why did the feminists go from thinking that was a serious issue to deal with to start claiming that the issue is actually the reverse of what it is? Well, in fact, after 1994 and the discovery that, in fact, the criminal justice system was actually being more lenient towards women, there was a shift towards less leniency towards women in the criminal justice system. And we know that because he was going to talk about why that's such a terrible thing.
As Fawcett's commission started to produce its results, there was a vast increase noted in women in custody. I think it increased between 1995 and 2005 by 69%.
Oh dear, what an unexpected result. The Home Office acknowledges that there is unequal treatment of men and women in the justice system, makes recommendations to train judges not to use stereotypes in their judging of cases, and suddenly the female population starts to rise for the next 10 years. At which point, people like Vera and the Fawcett Society think, oh shit, we better do something about that.
I had some contact with Fiona McTaggart, then a Minister of State at the Home Office, who wanted to look into the whole state of women in prison. And between us, we came up with the perfect chair for that inquiry, who was Jean Corston, now Baroness Corston, who sadly can't be here today, but who still remains a terrific force for women and imprisonment.
So what happened then in 2006 was the Corston Report came out by Baroness Corston, looking into how women are treated in the criminal justice system. Jean Corston made the following recommendations. My first recommendation concerns the treatment of men and women within the criminal justice system. From April 2007, the government will have a statutory duty to take positive action to eliminate gender discrimination and promote equality under the Equality Act. To eliminate inequality, even though the trend was towards equality, even though the trend towards equality was brought about because judges had been trained to be less discriminating and less prejudiced in their judgments they made regarding men and women, and to rely less on stereotypes, to challenge their preconceived notions. Judges recommend that there was a move towards equality, and Corston's about to do something about it in the name of equality. I have seen little evidence that much preparatory work is in hand in respect of the imminent statutory duty or of any real understanding that treating men and women the same results in inequality of outcome. Equality does not mean treating everyone the same. The new gender equality duty means that men and women should be treated with equivalent respect according to need. Equality must embrace not just fairness but also inclusivity. This will result in some different services and policies for men and women. There are fundamental differences between male and female offenders, and those at risk of offending can indicate a different and distinct approach is needed for women. For example, most women do not commit crime. Well, no one's suggesting you should imprison the ones that don't. No one was suggesting that for a moment. Anyway, women with histories of violence and abuse are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and can be described as victims as well as offenders. Women can be described as victims as well as offenders, but that's not true of men. So none of the men that are put in prison have at any time experienced violence or abuse at the hands of another. I find that rather hard to believe. Biological difference between men and women has different social and personal consequences. I thought feminists would just be against biological essentialism, but that is biological essentialism. Maybe she's not a feminist. And maybe these people need to be called out. They stop calling themselves a feminist. Proportionally, more women than men are remanded in custody. That's just a lie. That's not a finding, that's a lie. Let's go back to the Home Office report of 1994. It said on remand, a smaller proportion of female offenders are remanded in custody than the males. One of the few studies to investigate the reasons, Morgan and Pierce in 1988, concluded this was partly because women were less likely than men to fall into high-risk categories, defined as those who had previously failed to appear after given court bail, or had been charged with a further offence while on bail, or of no fixed abode. This was only part of the story, however. Women falling into low-risk categories were also less likely to be remanded in custody than their male counterparts. So, one of the reasons why men were more likely to be remanded in custody, aside from there being actually a gender discrimination already, was that they were more likely to have no fixed abode. In other words, they were more likely to be homeless, which is another inequality that doesn't get discussed in this particular speech, but is another inequality that we need to talk about. Men are more likely to be homeless than women are, and therefore they're more likely to be remanded in custody. That was, after all, 1994. Maybe the world's changed since then. So in 2014, the Ministry of Justice paper on women in the criminal justice system says of the 10,704 females and 93,287 males appearing at the Crown Court in 2013, 19% and 37% respectively were remanded in custody. These proportions have been broadly similar over the past 5 years. Well, anyone can make a mistake, but you'd think in somebody as important a job as Baroness Corston, who is making recommendations to the government policy, that she should have a fact checker or something to clear up any little niggling mistakes like that, where you've actually obviously read your graph upside down or something. Or maybe she was just lying. Possibility, isn't it? Women commit a different range of offences from men. They commit more acquisitive crime and have a lower involvement in serious violence, criminal damage and professional crime. Relationship problems feature strongly in women's pathways into crime. Of course they do. Of course they do. A man must have made her do it. Coercion by men, it's right here. Coercion by men can form a route into criminal activity for some women. Drug addiction plays a huge part in all offending and is disproportionately the case of women. Mental health problems are far more prevalent among women in prison than the male prison population or in the general population. Outside prison, men are more likely to commit suicide than women, but the position is reversed inside prison. Actually, it kind of equalises inside prison. You're putting men in prison to protect them from suicide, is that the idea? Self-harm in prison is a huge problem and more prevalent in the women's estate. Women prisoners are far more likely than men to be the primary carers of young children, and this factor makes the prison experience significantly different for women than men. Yeah, but if they're in prison, that probably wouldn't be the case. I'd imagine if the women were in prison, then men would be more likely to be primary caregivers. Because of the small number of women's prisons and their geographical location, women tend to be located further from their homes than male prisoners. to the detriment of maintaining family ties, receiving visits, and resettlement back in the community. Prison is disproportionately harsher for women because prisons and the practices within them have for the most part been designed for men. I love the idea she's going on prisons going, oh, it's very masculine here, look, there's no soft furnishings, the showers are cold. It's the sort of thing that men would like, isn't it? Men love that. No silk bedding, no floral patterns. I love it. I love the idea that somebody goes, how do you design this prison? Well, what do men like? Well, men like bars. Men are really keen on bars. Men are really keen on stark white walls and the idea that prisons have been designed because it's what men really like. Levels of security in prison were put in place to stop men escaping, whereas women are so good that all you need is a sign that says, don't go beyond this point. Stay there. Stay there. That's all they need. And they go, oh, all right. Because women in prison are there because they're law-abiding. So that's all they need. They just need a sign saying, come on, you know the rules. The women's prison population suffers disproportionately because of the rapidly increasing male prison population and the pressure to find places for men, leading to re-rolling of female prisons. One of the arguments for less women in prison is, well, there's too many men in prison. Well, there's another way you can sort that problem out, isn't there? If you entertain the idea, 30% of women in prison lose their accommodation while in prison. Compared to, oh, you're not going to give us a statistic for men. We don't know. We don't know. All we know is that men are overrepresented in the homeless population, and in fact that's one of the reasons why men are more likely to be remanded in custody, is because they're more likely to be homeless. But we're going to talk about how women can lose their accommodation because we put in prison, but we don't know the statistic for men. You're not going to tell us the statistic for men. Maybe the statistic for men is just the same, or maybe it's worse. Maybe there is a link between men being overrepresented in the population of homeless and men being overrepresented in the prison population. Because maybe prison is correlated with losing accommodation. And women and men are different. Equal treatment of men and women does not result in equal outcomes. I was going to cry there. But equal treatment of men and women does not result in equal outcomes. I don't know what she's arguing there. These are the same people that talk about the gender earnings gap as if it's discrimination against women. And we're saying, well, they've got the same opportunities, they just make different choices. But it's now saying that men and women should be treated unequally because they're different. Recommendation: every agency within the criminal justice system must prioritise and accelerate preparations to implement the gender equality duty and radically transform the way they deliver services to women. Life and death. How women experience prison. The need for a radically different approach. These are the women I saw in prisons. Most were mothers. Some had children with them immediately prior to custody. Some had handed them to relatives, or their children had been taken into care or adopted. Some were pregnant. Some discovered they were pregnant when they had no idea that could be a possibility. They were drug users. It was not uncommon to have £200 a day crack and heroin habits disclosed. They were alcoholics. They often looked very thin and unwell. They had been sexually, emotionally, and physically abused. They were not in control of their lives. They did not have many choices. They were noisy, and at first sight confident and brash, but this belied their frailty and vulnerability and masked their lack of self-confidence and esteem. They self-harmed. They had mental health problems. They were poor. They were not all the same, despite everything you've already said. They were not all the same, so everything you've said up to now is a generalisation. They were individuals. There were significant minority groups, including BME and foreign national women. Presumably, then, the opposite is true for the men. So, none of the men were parents. They were most of them weren't parents. None of them were pregnant. I would agree with that. In fact, I wouldn't just say most of the men weren't pregnant. I would say none of the men were pregnant. I'm going to gamble on that one. None of the men were drug users, and they were all teetotal. They were all very healthy. The men in prison were all very healthy and had perfectly wholesome and carefree lives they were fully in control of, lots of choices. They seemed shy at first, but this belied their inner strength and self-reliance, masked their sense of pride and bonhomie. They all made positive affirmations in the mirror each morning, and they were perfectly well adjusted and rich, and they were all exactly the same. And they were all white, presumably, and English and middle class. Prisons are all full of Etonites. You go to a male prison, everyone there went to Eton and a fantastic education. Soon to be published report of women in custody explains how women recounted the stress that came from newly encountering the prison environment, with crowding, noise, and a threatening atmosphere. They were alarmed at sharing cells with women with mental health problems and who self-harmed. They were frightened and unprepared when confronted with women who were suffering severe drug withdrawal or seizures. They complained that the prison environment was dirty and unhygienic sharing of facilities. 5 women in a dormitory could be sharing one cell sink, which was being used for personal washing as well as cleaning eating utensils. There was a lack of fresh air and ventilation. Some women reported that vermin were present in the areas where they ate, slept, and stored their personal food items. Prison facilities hindered them from maintaining self-care, including limited access to personal hygiene products and restricted access to bathing. Shower facilities were often dirty. I, too, was dismayed to find that in some of the prisons I visited, there were toilets, often without lids. In cells and dormitories, sometimes screened by just a curtain, sometimes not screened at all. It is humiliating for women to have to use these facilities in the presence of others, most particularly during menstruation. Yeah, well, of course, this is not humiliating at all for men. That's probably how men would choose to live, like that, with vermin. Definitely, yeah. Love a bit of vermin around. I like sharing cells with mad people, if I can, and I don't care about lack of hygiene. I am resistant to all bacteria. We must find better ways to keep out of prison those women who pose no threat to society and to improve the prison experience for those who do. One example is the regular, repetitive, unnecessary overuse of strip searching in women's prisons, which is humiliating, degrading, and undignified, and the dreadful invasion of privacy. For women who have suffered past abuse, particularly sexual abuse, it is an appalling introduction to prison life, an unwelcome reminder of previous victimization. It is also clear that prison is not the right place for many women. They need help and caring, therapeutic environments to assist them rebuild their lives. This is not an easy option. It is demanding a great deal of women to delve into issues they prefer to block out. For those with drug addictions, clinical detoxification does not stop the habit. Those women for whom prison is necessary would clearly benefit from being in smaller units close to home or more easily accessible for visitors, such as in city centres. The existing system of women's prisons should be dismantled and replaced by smaller, secure units for the minority of women from whom the public requires protection. Recommendations. The government should announce within 6 months a clear strategy to replace existing women's prisons with suitable, geographically dispersed, small, multifunctional custodial centres within 10 years. That's not a bad recommendation. Don't mind that. More prisons that are smaller in size would actually make sense. Corston's recommendations here. Custodial sentences for women must be reserved for serious and violent offenders who pose a threat to the public. Women unlikely to receive a custodial sentence should not be remanded in custody. Women must never be sent to prison for their own good, to teach them a lesson, for their own safety, or to access services such as detoxification. More supported bail placements for women suitable to their needs must be provided. Defendants who are primary carers of young children should be remanded in custody only after consideration of a probation report on the probable impact on the children. Community solutions for non-violent women offenders should be the norm. Community sentences must be designed to take account of women's particular vulnerabilities and domestic and childcare commitments. Sentences must be informed about the existence and nature of those schemes that do exist and should support and visit them. Restrictions placed on sentences around breach of community orders must be made more flexible as a matter of urgency. Section 178 Criminal Justice Act 2003 should be implemented more generally. Bail information schemes in women's prisons must be properly monitored, resourced and used. So going back to the Ministry of Justice statistics, we can see how the effects of Corston's recommendations went. Between 1990 and the beginning of the 2000s, we have an increase in women in prisons as a percentage of the overall prison population. As a percentage of the prison population, they rose to about 5%, and since then they've been dropping off. So the brief history lesson is that in 1994 it was recognised that women were treated more leniently by the criminal justice system than men were, and recommendations were made to judges to be less sexist, stop being so sexist. And as a result, the female population of the prison service rose all the way up to 5% of the prison service. So the percentage that were men had gone down to 95%, and that was considered to be horrendous and a cause of great concern. So Baroness Corston rode in on her white charger, had a look at prisons, said, "This is no place for a lady, let's sort that out," and made recommendations to treat men and women differently, since when the sentencing gap has widened once more. Remembering that was in the name of equality. Her paper recommending that women be treated differently actually used the word equality to justify it.
All the evidence shows that men are more likely to be a victim of violent crime than women in this country.
True, says The Independent. I'm sure they've got a butt coming. They have. The majority of victims of violent crime in the UK are men. However, the majority of this is perpetrated also by men. It is not gender motivated and is not domestic. This treaty is designed to focus on domestic violence, the victims of which are estimated at between 80% and 98% of women by a variety of measures. Well, if it's designed to be looking specifically at domestic violence, why does it have to say violence against women and domestic violence throughout? Violence against women and domestic violence. Just say domestic violence if that's all you're concentrating on. It doesn't. It has violence against women separate to domestic violence. And secondly, the statistics it's giving there of between 80 and 99% is just wrong. 80%, now that actually is fatality. If you're saying 80%, yeah, 80% of the fatalities as a result of domestic violence are female. You could have put forward that argument earlier if you wanted to, but you didn't. No, is it going to say 99%? Cited the ONS statistics already, and it is 1 in 3. But I'm being fair there by using the ONS statistics because they're official. But okay, let's bring on some others, shall we? And this is from the Harvard study of 2007. As you can see here, across the top we have who was doing the reporting there on the survey. But what was found was that 70.7% of the non-reciprocal violence was perpetrated by women. This varied between 67.7% and 74.9%, depending whether it was women or men doing the reporting. What was also found in that study was that the chances of injury greatly increased from 8.1% to 25.3% if the violence was reciprocated. And similarly for women, the chances of being have been injured increased from 20% to 31.4% if it was reciprocal. Finding that IPV is more frequently perpetrated by women is more likely to result in injury and perpetration in the context of reciprocal IPV can best be understood in the context of a conflict-based theoretical model, which suggests that conflict leads to increasingly coercive interactions that may spiral into violence. For example, suppose partner A shoves partner B and then partner B does not retaliate but instead storms out of the house, the violence may end as non-reciprocal violence with no injury. If partner B retaliates by slapping or punching partner A, the violence then becomes reciprocal and injury becomes more likely of each escalating blow. This pattern suggests that retaliation may be a primary mechanism for the increased injury associated with reciprocal violence. Though we cannot test this hypothesis using this study's data, an escalation explanation is supported by longitudinal studies that show that violence between relationship partners tends to escalate over time from verbal abuse to physical abuse, and the victimization from violence is a strong predictor of perpetration of violence. The escalation of negative coercive interactions has been central to and strongly supported in Patterson's work, which describes family processes that support the development of aggression and has been suggested to play a role in dating violence. In such cases, it may be important to work with both relationship partners to help understand when and how conflict escalates to violence and how to interrupt that process. Intervention with violent couples has been extremely controversial, but has recently been recognized as viable in some cases, such as when there is low to moderate violence, when both partners agree to counselling and wish to remain an intact couple, when violence is reciprocal, and when there are low levels of intimidation, fear, and control. Couples counselling would not be appropriate for patterns of partner violence in which there is severe abuse, high levels of fear on the part of the victim, and control of one partner by the other. Or going to Murray Strauss's paper, 30 Years of Denying the Evidence on Gender Symmetry in Partner Violence, Implications of Prevention and Treatment, this paper in 2010. Murray Strauss has been studying the field since the 70s, however. His 6 studies here, National Family Violence Survey in 1975 found that there were 25% of violent couples in which only the man was violent, and 27% in which only the woman was violent, and 48% both were violent. In 1990 to 2002 found the same. National Comorbidity Survey of sort of rates with 23% male-only violence, 24% female-only violence, and 54% both violent. A study in 2001 had actually men being less violent than women, 35% being women-only violence, 50% being both violent. 2008, the same. 2009, International Parenting Study, 22% women being violent, 12% men being violent, and 66% reciprocal violence. And the Philippines Health and Nutrition Survey has 38% women being violent, 22% men being violent, and 40% both being violent. Despite the fact that that has been going on since the 70s, obviously, there was near parity being shown in studies that go back to the 70s. It's only been in the last 10 years that the number of women convicted for perpetrating domestic abuse has quadrupled from 806 to 4,866. I think some newspapers are reporting this sudden increase in women being convicted of perpetrating domestic abuse and men reporting it as being the result of some sort of epidemic of female violence. It isn't a sudden epidemic of female violence. There's always been female violence. It's coming to light. What this is suddenly changing is the fact that men are starting to talk about it because they recognise that they can be victims, and they realise that they're not going to be ignored or dismissed. But then having initiatives like the Istanbul Convention iterating once again that domestic violence is something that chiefly affects women, that is going to discourage men from coming forward.
1B says it wants to see the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. Yet I do not see how introducing a specific duty to eliminate all forms of discrimination against just women I don't see how that is not discriminatory in itself. I sometimes wish people could see the irony of their proposals. Surely we should just want to eliminate all forms of discrimination, full stop. It's in effect saying this, what Article 1B is in effect saying, that if it's discrimination against a man, it's okay.
False. The Independent says judiciously, the Convention contains provisions for the protection of victims of all genders and identities. Moreover, policy that fights oppression of one group is not itself automatically oppressive of other victims who are not included in that group. Well, I can't argue with that, with using facts, because that's an opinion. What's been expressed there is an opinion, and I can just express that my opinion isn't the same. The opinion that they're expressing is that a policy that fights oppression of one group is not itself automatically oppressive of other victims who are not included in that group. Well, yeah, it's not automatically oppressive of other victims who are not included in that group, but in this case it is, particularly when the definitions of what is abuse are expanding to only look at one half of the group, whilst expanding the definitions of abuse. It means that you're finding increasing ways of finding the other group abusive. And since they're not protected, then you're actually just giving more reasons to abuse them and get away with it. Because then you can say, oh, it was provocation, I was provoked, he made me feel scared, or he was controlling me by asking me about my movements. And yet he hasn't got the same level of protection. Definitely here an imbalance of power has been created between men and women. And the other thing is, we use our stereotypes to judge how people behave when we don't have sufficient information. And when there are gaps in our knowledge, we fill those gaps in using stereotypes. So whilst the stereotype is reinforced that men are perpetrators and women are victims, when you have gaps in your memory, and you will have gaps in your memory if you are experiencing traumatic experiences, and violence is a traumatic experience, how do you fill in those gaps in your memory? It's not just other people that say you must have done something to deserve it. Sometimes it's the victim that says, I must have done something to deserve it. And if the victim's a man, that means even the victim might see themselves as a perpetrator. Special measures that are necessary to prevent and protect women from gender-based violence shall not be considered discrimination under the terms of this convention. To what extent does that enabling law prevent protection from violence from women? Because the definition of violence is expanding quite a lot. It's expanded a lot. Violence can include verbal violence now, include emotional violence. If you call the police and have her arrested, is that violence against women? Even being silent can be taken as abusive by the definitions of emotional violence. Even withdrawal could be considered to be violence. Definitions of violence are expanding, and anything that is necessary to prevent violence against women shall not be considered discrimination. The Istanbul Convention is a very dangerous and discriminatory document, and Philip Davies was right to oppose it. And only 2 members of Parliament did oppose it, because the majority don't want to be seen as misogynists. And they're quite right, because Philip Davies is now being portrayed by the media as being a misogynist. Most of the general public are buying it and falling for it hook, line and sinker. To demonstrate, here are some comments from beneath that article. Next, you know, Davies will be assuring us that 2/3 of the victims of bullfighting are matadors. It's a strange analogy to make, isn't it? Because bulls are clearly bigger and stronger than matadors, in the same way as men are clearly bigger and stronger than women, we assume. I think the difference in strength between a man and a woman is probably less significant than the difference in strength between a bull and a matador. But this person thinks that domestic violence is just like bullfighting. You know, bullfighting works. That's a interesting analogy to make regarding domestic violence. Yeah, no, actually, that is the statistics. ONS are saying that. ONS are saying that it's 2/3 of the victims of domestic violence are the one who is physically weaker, possibly more cunning. So you think it's sexist to say that women should receive specialised protection from violence that is specific to women? That's like saying it's unfair to only give council houses to people who can't afford rent. It's another interesting analogy to pull up when it comes to inequalities between men and women, because of course, yeah, some of us can't afford rent. And some of us are more likely to get council houses than others, and it's not purely based on whether or not you can afford the rent. And when it comes to prioritising who gets a council house, women are on the top of the list, particularly women with children, which is fair. I mean, it's fair to house people that have children first. But beyond that, yeah, when it comes to getting a council house, whether you can afford the rent or not, men are at the bottom of the list. It's a long list for everyone. Quite frankly, there isn't enough council housing. There isn't enough social housing in this country right now, and it's a long list for everyone. But you know how far down that list you're going to be is partly down to your gender, and it's men who are less likely to get council housing than women. 71% of the homeless in the UK are male. Probably not the best thing to bring up if you're trying to argue that there's no sexism towards men. How could, full stop, one vote for this person, full stop? He has health problems. He needs to see a shrink. He is unable to communicate with ordinary people and dire needs. The sooner he's voted out, the better. Then he can be committed and given treatment. Yeah, he's got difficulty communicating, has he? He's got a difficulty communicating, okay. Okay, the more serious point. Mental health issues. Isn't that a funny thing to bring up? Because, of course, we established there that, well, if you haven't seen my previous thing on refuge, just a couple of videos back, one of the things it says on the refuge website is that mental health has got nothing to do with domestic violence. That domestic violence perpetrators do not have mental health issues. And as we saw from Baroness Corston's analysis of the prison population, women in prison are more likely to have mental health problems than men in prison. So what do we know about mental health? Mental health doesn't cause you to be violent, unless you're a woman. No, it doesn't cause you to be criminal, no, unless you're a woman. What can mental health cause? It can cause you to disagree with feminists, apparently. That's one of the things. The leading cause of disagreeing with feminists is mental health issues, but criminality and violence, that's nothing to do with mental health, unless you're a woman. Par for the course in these comments, though. Whataboutery is an epidemic here about any issue related to violence against women. You make the point that some issues are gender-specific and some aren't, and the legislation reflects that, but it's not good enough for the whataboutery PhDs. Now, I think Essex Girl is completely misunderstanding what the point is. The point is not to say that this is a gendered issue and the legislation reflects that. The point is legislation reflects a perception that it is a gendered issue when it isn't. It's not a gendered issue. That's what the whataboutery is about. The whataboutery is pointing out that we are being discriminated against by legislation that treats as gendered issues things that aren't gendered. By the way, boys and men are mentioned once and once only, in the Istanbul Convention. Would you like to hear it? Under General Obligations, point 4, parties shall take the necessary measures to encourage all members of society, especially men and boys, to contribute actively to preventing all forms of violence covered by the scope of this convention. In other words, we have got no protection for you, but it's your responsibility to protect the women. How am I supposed to protect them from the lesbians? I'm not having a go at lesbians. I don't know anything wrong with lesbians. I've got some of my best friends are lesbians. But, in fact, it is the lesbians I'm sticking up for, because women in lesbian relationships are 50% more likely to suffer intimate partner violence than women in heterosexual relationships. So, I don't think that's my responsibility. And even if it was my responsibility, what am I supposed to do? There's nothing I could do to protect her that wouldn't actually involve harassing in some way another woman.